Alright, so here's what I think is actually going on with Tulsi Gabbard's lawsuit against Google. Well, I'm not going to tell you right now, because then you're not going to watch the video to the end.
Don't skip to the end of the video!
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber. I do vlogs, and for the longest time now, people have been asking me to tackle the Tulsi Gabbard versus Google lawsuit, and I've got to tell you, I was very excited to do it. I was excited to do it, I was hoping to love it, I wanted to love it. I mean, what could be better than a Democratic presidential candidate suing the biggest, most evil corporation on earth for censorship? I wanted to love it, I wanted to believe in it, but after having read it thoroughly, I genuinely believe that it might have been drafted by an intern after they had just binge-watched all episodes of Dawson's Creek. Alright, jokes aside, because like my father always says, those who don't do can critique, and it's the benefit of having not done the actual work. It's very easy to critique the work that you didn't have a hand in doing. But one of the biggest pitfalls of actually doing things is that it does in fact expose you to critique, much in the same way that every video I put out onto the internet exposes me to critique, and I read each and every critical comment, take them to heart. They break my heart just a little bit. But my critique of the Tulsi Gabbard lawsuit is not intended to be gratuitous, Twitter-like critique for the sakes of thumbs up or upvotes. I genuinely don't believe the primary objective of Tulsi Gabbard's lawsuit was about the drafting or the law, but we'll get there. First, let's start by walking through the relevant allegations of the lawsuit itself. And yes, it is another car vlog today because it is the weekend. It is a rainy Sunday with about, I think we have 5 kids in our house right now, and the rainy car is the quietest place I can find to work today. And how soothing is the sound of that rain falling on the windshield of this car. Tulsi Now Inc., a principal campaign committee, plaintiff versus Google LLC, a Delaware limited liability company, endos 1 through 10. Complaint for violations of 1. First Amendment, 2. California Constitution Article 1, Section 2, 3. California Unruh Civil Rights Act, Section 51, 4. Unfair competition, 5. Implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, 6. Lanham Act, 7. Declaratory and injunctive relief. So first thing to notice right off the bat, the plaintiff is Tulsi Now Inc., not Tulsi Gabbard herself, but rather her campaign committee. This doesn't really change anything in terms of the substance of the lawsuit, and it's probably legally required because, as we're going to see, the basis of the lawsuit was having an ad campaign suspended, and that ad campaign was probably owned by Tulsi Now and not by Tulsi Gabbard herself. Now, also of note, I did a live stream breaking down this lawsuit with Nate Brody, another YouTube lawyer. A lot of people say they don't necessarily have the time to sit through a 2-hour live stream and ask me to do a shorter, standard vlog on the subject, which I'm doing. But I'm going to steal some of the knowledge and theorizing from Nate Brody, who opined that another reason why the plaintiff might have been Tulsi Now Inc. and not Tulsi Gabbard personally is that if the lawsuit is a total failure, Tulsi Gabbard personally can wash her hands of it and say, I wasn't plaintiff to that lawsuit, it was my committee. Take it for what it's worth, it's a theory, but let's get into the actual allegations now. Principal Campaign Committee for presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard brings this lawsuit against defendant Google for serious and continuous violations of Tulsi's right to free speech. Since at least June 2019, Google has used its control over online political speech to silence Tulsi Gabbard, a candidate millions of Americans want to hear from. With this lawsuit, Tulsi seeks to stop Google from further intermeddling in the 2020 United States presidential election. And we haven't even gotten into the dramatic part yet. Introduction.
Drama.
We live in a time of unprecedented political upheaval and division in the United States. Uncertainty and mistrust in American institutions, most notably the United States government, are at record highs. Everything from basic norms of civility and compromise to the sanctity of American elections suddenly seems in flux. Americans wonder how we got there, and they want to know where we're going. And let me say, if I'm making light of this allegation, it's not of the substance of the allegation, it is of the drafting of the allegation and its place in a lawsuit against Google. I am from Quebec, and the rules of practice in Quebec are to the effect that you only make allegations of fact, and you only make 1 allegation per paragraph. And the reason why you do that is, in practice, you have to make evidence of every allegation you include in a lawsuit. You have to prove the allegation. How does anyone go about proving this introductory allegation? It's argumentation, it's pleading, that's fine. And incidentally, you only have a few paragraphs to really seize the attention of your reader. When a reader starts mumbling to themselves under their breath while sitting in a car while reading the first paragraph of a lawsuit, you know you're off to a bad start. Against this backdrop, it is not surprising that the race for the 2020 Democratic nomination for President of the United States is the most hotly contested and the most politically open in recent memory. Americans want to hear fresh, diverse voices as they seek a new leader in this time of turmoil. Americans need to hear those voices. This is a lawsuit that reads more like a public speech, and while it might very well make a very good and compelling public speech, it is not necessarily the best drafting for for a lawsuit. Let's skip some of the intro paragraphs, get to paragraph 7. On June 28, 2019, at the height of Gabbard's popularity among internet searchers in the immediate hours after the debate ended, and in the thick of the critical post-debate period, when television viewers, radio listeners, newspaper readers, and millions of other Americans are discussing and searching for presidential candidates, Google suspended Tulsi's Google Ads account without warning. For hours, as millions of Americans searched Google for information about Tulsi, and as Tulsi was trying through Google to speak to them, her Google Ads account was arbitrarily and forcibly taken offline. Throughout this period, the campaign worked frantically to gather more information about the suspension, to get through to someone at Google who could get the account back online, and to understand and remedy the restraint that had been placed on Tulsi's speech at precisely the moment when everyone wanted to hear from her. And so here is the first substantive problem that I have with this lawsuit as drafted. They are trying to conflate Google Ads with freedom of speech. They are trying to present the argument that because Google suspended Tulsi's ad account, they somehow suppressed her freedom of speech to reach the people that were interested in hearing from her. And I believe that that is not only a problem in fact, that is also a problem in law. Paragraph 12. Google's arbitrary and capricious treatment of Gabbard's campaign should raise concerns for policymakers everywhere about the company's ability to use its dominance to impact political discourse in a way that interferes with the upcoming 2020 presidential elections. In this case, Google has sought to silence Tulsi Gabbard, a presidential candidate who has vocally called for greater regulation and oversight of, you guessed it, Google. But this could happen to any candidate running in any election. You guessed it? I don't mean to be overly critical here, but who actually includes sarcastic comments like that in pleadings that are intended to go to a federal court and trial by jury? And there's an expression in French, trop fort casse pas, which means like too strong doesn't break, and there's nothing wrong with making something overly strong, but sometimes trop fort casse. Sometimes when you try to hammer home a point with a little too much sarcasm, you actually end up by losing credibility. We knew Tulsi was talking about Google. We didn't need the sarcastic, you guessed it, in brackets. Hey Siri, call Wonderful Wife.
Hey.
What's up?
We need cheese and milk.
Okay, I'll be there in 15 minutes.
Okay.
Bye. Be right back. All right, now where were we? Paragraph 13, my favorite allegation of the lawsuit.
With this lawsuit, Tulsi is fighting back. She will be heard.
And I'm thoroughly convinced that this is the only purpose of the lawsuit. It's not to win, it is simply to be heard. All right, and then we have some more paragraphs about how they silenced Tulsi right at the most critical moment when she was the most searched for candidate on the internet, which incidentally on the substance of the argument seems to undermine exactly what Tulsi is saying, that her voice was silenced by Google. All right, jurisdiction and venue. Paragraph 17 and following contain allegations to the effect that the federal courts of the state of California have jurisdiction to act because this calls into question federal laws, that being the Constitution and the Lanham Act, and state laws, and that California is the proper venue because it is in the state of California where Google does business. That is the technical legal stuff to establish jurisdiction. Let's get into the allegations of fact, specifically as relates to the alleged wrong committed by Google against Tulsi. Throughout the lawsuit, Tulsi is alleging that she was specifically targeted by Google because of her anti-Google positions that she has voiced on the campaign trail. Paragraph 26, Gabbard has repeatedly voiced her concerns about the power wielded by Google and other big tech firms on Twitter. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I agree with Senator Warren on the need to break up big tech companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon. Will be introducing similar legislation in US House. And the thing about this is that it's a double-edged sword. Tulsi is trying to show why she was singled out by Google because of her anti-Google policies, and in support of that narrative, she alleges a tweet in which she publicly agrees with Elizabeth Warren in terms of breaking up big tech companies like Google. But the double-edged sword about that allegation and the way that allegation sort of undermines the story that Tulsi is trying to tell is that Elizabeth Warren herself, who has been equally critical of Google, has not been targeted by Google in the way Tulsi says she has. But in my humble opinion, even more damaging than this double-edged sword is the timeline that Tulsi tries to set out to illustrate the capricious, malicious, and fraudulent behavior by Google. Paragraph 28 and following. Tulsi Gabbard's message is resonating with the American people after the June 26, 27, 2019 Democratic debate, when millions of Americans heard Gabbard's message for the first time. She was the single most searched for candidate, and she accomplished this despite having the third lowest amount of speaking time. Again, alleging that Google is silencing her voice while admitting that she was the most searched for candidate on Google. Paragraph 29. In order to share her message with the American people, which had already been demonstrated to increase her popularity, the campaign created a Google Ads account with Google. The account was governed by terms of use. Among other provisions, the terms provided that Google had the right to, quote, reject or remove a specific target, ad, or destination at any time for any or no reason. Maybe I am reading this allegation wrong, but I don't think I am. It seems that Tulsi only created her Google Ads account very recently or contemporaneously with the debates. And by her own admission, she accepted and agreed to be governed by Google's terms of use. This condition is what we would refer to under Quebec law as a clause purement potestative, which is a purely discretionary clause. Basically, we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, for whatever the reason, and you have no say in it. And these types of conditions are sometimes determined to be unenforceable. But at the very least, all that we have right now is Tulsi admitting and acknowledging that she agreed to the terms of use and agreed to be governed by them. And Google has specific terms of use as relates to targeted ads. And why is this relevant? We'll get there. Paragraph 31. Google has a monopoly over the internet search market. Over 88% of all internet searches in the United States occur on Google. Over 92% of all internet searches worldwide occur on Google. Google averages at least 6 billion searches a day. Google Ads can reach people on YouTube, which is owned by Google. All right, we get it. Google is massive. Google owns YouTube. If Google is not a monopoly, it is a near monopoly. The purpose of this allegation is to illustrate the fact that Google is such a massive monopoly that it should be treated as a government entity by extension for application of First Amendment claims. And you'll recall from previous vlogs, First Amendment violations only apply to government institutions. They don't apply to private enterprises. With an exception, that exception being if the private enterprise ought to be treated as a government entity for the purpose of First Amendment claims. And when would a private enterprise be treated as a government entity for the purpose of First Amendment free speech claims? There are a few exceptions, one of them being entanglement. If the private enterprise receives so much funding from the government that they have to be treated as a government entity. If they are just, as a matter of fact, government entities despite being private companies, and you could think of sort of the corporate municipality. And the other exception, which Tulsi is trying to argue applies in this case, if the company in fact has a monopoly. Paragraphs 34 and following is when the timeline gets a little wonky. Paragraph 34. On June 28, 2019, right in the heart of the key post-debate campaigning and fundraising period for Gabbard, the campaign witnessed internet searches for Gabbard start skyrocketing in real time. Millions of Americans wanted to hear from Tulsi Gabbard, and they went to Google to hear what she had to say. First of all, that is at the very least a lofty and potentially an inaccurate summary of why people go to Google to search things. People went to Google to search for Gabbard. It doesn't necessarily mean that people went to Google to hear what Gabbard had to say. It doesn't necessarily mean that people went to Google so that Gabbard can talk to them. What we know is that people were searching for Gabbard. Period. The campaign wanted to speak to the millions of Americans asking about Gabbard through Google. Translation, the campaign wanted to talk to the people who were searching for Gabbard. And how do you do that? You run ads so that the first results that come up are ads targeting people searching for Gabbard. Paragraph 36. Except in late June 2019, on the exact day when millions of Americans turned to Google to learn more about Gabbard, on the exact day when Americans made Tulsi Gabbard the most searched for Democratic candidate on Google, Google abruptly suspended the account. In late June 2019, Google abruptly suspended Tulsi's Google Ads account. An account which by the allegations seems to have only been created in June, if not late June. In late June, where the Democratic debates only occurred on June 26th and June 27th, which presumably means that Tulsi's Google Ads account was probably very inactive until late June 2019. Paragraph 37. On June 28th, 2019, millions of Americans asked Google about Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi sought to answer them, but Google silenced her. So the timeline is a little unclear here. The debates were on the 26th and the 27th. People were searching for Tulsi on the 28th, and it's alleged that it was in late June 2019 that Google suspended her account, but it seems to have been suspended on June 28th. A Google Ads account which by Tulsi's own admission was relatively newly created and which was admittedly trying to target ads at people who were currently searching for Tulsi Gabbard on Google. And paragraph 38 is really where the lawsuit undermines itself. Paragraph 38, despite the drastic nature of Google's action, arbitrarily suspending the advertising account of a major candidate for president of the United States the day after the debate, at precisely the moment that candidate was trending on Google, Google never offered a real or consistent reason for suspending the account. First, Google said that the account was suspended due to, quote, problems with billing information or violations of our advertising policies. Then Google said the account was suspended because Google, quote, identified suspicious behavior in the payment activity in your account. Later, Google changed course again and said the account was temporarily suspended to verify your billing information and policy compliance. Eventually, Google lifted the suspension with no real explanation, just an opaque statement that Google had re-reviewed your account and you can now use it to advertise. This allegation illustrates a number of things that people should bear in mind in law. It's not just because you include an allegation that someone did something maliciously, capriciously, arbitrarily, that it is somehow true. Those qualifications are conclusions. Good drafting means that people should focus less on the qualifications and more on the facts that would allow someone to come to that conclusion. And what are the facts in this particular paragraph? What is Google's explanation as to why they temporarily suspended the account? Problems with billing information or violations of our advertising policies. Google identified suspicious behavior in the payment activity in your account. And the third was that the account was temporarily suspended to verify your billing information and policy compliance. The third excuse sounds a lot like the first, and the second excuse, suspicious behavior in the payment activity, makes total sense given an account that was newly created and that probably saw a massive spike in ad costs on June 28th. The allegation tries to qualify Google's conduct as drastic and arbitrary when the allegation itself tends to undermine that qualification. And by the allegation itself, it seems that the suspension was pretty short-lived. But that is the factual crux of Tulsi's cause of action against Google, that Google suspended her Google Ads account at the peak of when she wanted to run targeted ads because Tulsi was the most Google searched for of the presidential candidates. Is that a First Amendment violation? Is that a violation of free speech? Not to have your speech silenced, but to be prevented from running targeted ads to a specific group of people who are Googling your name. And what damages could Tulsi have suffered? Paragraph 41. Google's suspension of the account caused irreparable damage to the campaign. Interest in searches for Gabbard during the post-debate timeframe had skyrocketed. Ads directing searchers to her campaign page would have brought Tulsi Gabbard's unique message to millions of Americans, and would have undoubtedly increased the campaign donations Gabbard received. Would have versus did. One is concrete, the other is purely hypothetical, and hypothetical damages are notoriously hard to prove in court, especially since there's going to be no basis of comparison for Tulsi to compare what donations she got after her ad account was suspended versus when her ad account was running normally, because by all accounts and by her own admission, this was the first time the Google Ads account was run. Additionally, Gabbard has learned that email communications sent by the campaign are classified as spam by Google's Gmail product at disproportionately high rates. If you are sending massive amounts of impersonal emails to people based on their Google search history, directing them to your product, campaign, or web page, that is spam by definition, and it belongs in the spam folder. And the allegation is that Google targeted Tulsi at a disproportionately high rate without any substantiating allegations to back up that claim. Where are the comparisons between the other presidential candidates? I don't like feeling like I'm defending Google, but these allegations of fact are insufficient to justify the claims being sought. We are now 16 pages into a lawsuit when Tulsi's factual claim against Google can be summarized in one paragraph. Google temporarily suspended Tulsi's Google Ads account on June 28th because of suspicious activity in the account and potential policy violations. And then we get into a half dozen paragraphs or so when Tulsi criticizes the government for ceding control of the internet to Google, which in my humble opinion puts the carriage in front of the horse, in that I don't think the government ceded control of the internet to Google. I think Google slowly built up a monopoly through a product that everybody ended up using. But regardless, these allegations really are, as far as I'm concerned, illustrating the ultimate objective of this lawsuit. This lawsuit is not intended to win. This lawsuit is intended to be the advertising that Google deprived Tulsi Gabbard of running on June 28th. But before I get into that, let's just go through the actual claims in law. Count 1, violations of the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Freedom of speech violation. Tulsi is saying that Google, by having shut down Tulsi's Google Ads, violated her freedom of speech. Although I understand where she's going, I do tend to disagree, because Tulsi's freedom of speech was actually never violated. Tulsi was never prevented from speaking to or reaching the people that were searching for her. She was temporarily prevented from running targeted ads targeting people who were searching for her, but that might very well violate Google's policies. But regardless, it was only temporary for a day or two for reasons that Tulsi might not agree with, but that might seem perfectly plausible to a jury. Tulsi wasn't prevented from using Twitter. She wasn't prevented from using YouTube. She wasn't even prevented from using Google. She was just temporarily prevented from running ads for maybe what seems like a 24-hour period. Is that a violation of free speech? I'm inclined to say no, but I'm curious if anybody thinks it is, to explain themselves and put it in the comment section below, and maybe I can pin one of those comments to the top. Count 2, California Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. Paragraph 77. Article 1, Section 2 of the California Constitution protects the liberty of speech and association, especially in public, quasi-public, and limited public spaces. From what I understand, every state has something of a constitution that is somewhat analogous to the United States Constitution. Analogous in letter and spirit, and from what I understand, the California Constitution basically reflects the spirit and intent of the United States Constitution and the First Amendment of freedom of speech. Count 3, California Unruh Civil Rights Act. Now, we have already discussed the Unruh Act, and that was in the PragerU lawsuit, where I was actually told that I was mispronouncing it and that it was not Unruh, it was Unruh. The California Unruh Civil Rights Act basically prohibits discrimination on a certain set of criteria which are enumerated in the Unruh Act. Notably absent from the prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Unruh Act is political ideology. And there is a question as to whether or not the grounds of discrimination in the Unruh Act are exhaustive or illustrative, and whether or not it is an act of spirit or an act of letter of the law, as in to say, did the Unruh Act intend to prohibit all forms of discrimination or just the forms of discrimination illustrated in the act itself? I don't know the answer to that question. If anybody knows the answer to that question, please let us know in the comment section below. But even that, the allegation that there was some sort of political discrimination that violated the terms of the Unruh Act, we all know that big tech is accused of having an anti-conservative bias, but Tulsi Gabbard is a Democrat. So what ideological or political discrimination is Tulsi even referring to? The allegation is that big tech, which has an anti-conservative bias, also in this case has an anti-Democrat bias, bias, or they just pick on people that they don't like. Either way, just as in the PragerU lawsuit, this is going to be a massive uphill battle to prove that there was an Unruh violation for an unspecified grounds of discrimination, that being political discrimination. But I'm extremely curious to see where this goes, and I hope it ultimately does get to a judgment, so at the very least, we can have an answer to that specific question. Count 4, Business and Professions Code. Paragraph 93, Google has committed acts of unfair competition as defined by Businesses and Professions Code by engaging in the practices described above. And from what I understand, the argument here is that Google says it will treat all of its clients equally, but doesn't in fact do so, as illustrated by the fact that they treated Tulsi Gabbard unfairly. Count 5, Breach of implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. This header is relatively self-explanatory, and ordinarily I'd say that it is the strongest basis of the claim that Tulsi has against Google. That being that Google is in fact acting in bad faith in their dealings with Tulsi Gabbard. The only problem, in my opinion, is that there are insufficient allegations in the proceedings to actually substantiate that claim. The only allegation of unfair dealings that we have in this entire lawsuit is that Google suspended Tulsi's Google Ads account on June 28th. Is that sufficient to justify a lawsuit for breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing? As the facts are alleged, I don't think so. Count 6, Lanham Act. Paragraph 107, Google engages in a pattern of practices of promulgating knowingly misleading and deceptive advertisements and of unfairly competing. For example, Google advertises itself as a forum for open expression by diverse speakers. Google ultimately and deceptively misrepresents the nature, characteristics, and qualities of Google's services and commercial activities as an equal and diverse public platform. Google likewise unfairly enhances the image and goodwill of its content while degrading the campaign by suggesting that the account somehow violates its terms of use. Paragraph 108, Google's false representations and unfair competition deceived and had a tendency to deceive substantial segments of Google's audiences, including potential advertisers like the campaign and the audience that view the ads. As a direct and proximate result of Google's actions complained of herein, the campaign has suffered and continues to suffer immediate and irreparable injury in fact, including lower viewership, lost potential campaign contributions, and harm to Gabbard's bid for President of the United States, for which there exists no adequate remedy at law. Except for potentially a somewhat ill-founded lawsuit against Google, which gets massive media coverage and gets people on the internet talking about it to such a point where my comment section is filled with enough comments asking me to do a vlog on the lawsuit itself. Count 7, declaratory and injunctive relief. Okay, whatever. So that is the lawsuit, and this is my humble and modest breakdown of the lawsuit and what I think of it. Ultimately, I don't think this is a winning lawsuit, and I don't think Tulsi filed this lawsuit in order to win. I think she filed it to start a discussion. I think she filed it to make a point, and I actually think she filed it to get back some of what she feels to have been the lost advertising when Google suspended her Google Ads account on June 28th, and I think that mission might actually be working. But now that we've gone through it in sufficient detail, let me know what you think, and if you like my channel and you like my content, please like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share my channel with someone who you think will appreciate it. If you want some merch, links are always below, PayPal support up in the top corner down below, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!